The economic history of socialism. What we're going to do now is look not so much at the idea of socialism, although we are going to say something about that because it's necessary to understand the main points, but rather the economic history of socialism, the history of the various attempts that have been made to put socialist ideas into practice over the last 230, 140 or so years. Now, first of all, we need to understand, make clear, that the word socialism did not always mean what it means now, or is commonly understood to mean now. In the early 19th century, it had a very different meaning, and you have to understand that if you read the writings of socialist advocates and activists right up until about the 1860s, including probably Marx and Engels. What it actually meant at that time was a laissez-faire market economy with a very limited economic role for government, quite different from the meaning it has now. But it meant, although a market economy, not a capitalist economy. It meant an economy that was organized in a non-capitalist way. You can get some idea of this from looking at some of the later writings of John Stuart Mill, because towards the end of his life, he became a supporter of this kind of political economy, and he explains in some of his later essays and his autobiography what he meant by this. So what were the main features of this laissez-faire market economy but non-capitalist economy that socialism as a word originally referred to? First of all, there was no rent. There was no landlord class, in other words. There was no way in which you were allowed to charge for access to land or buildings. Secondly, there was no intellectual property. There was no patents, no copyright. Thirdly, there was the ability to monetize personal credit so that private individuals or groups of individuals could issue their own money, essentially, in the form of promissory notes. This was a way of getting round what was supposed to be the money monopoly of the banking system. But the most important thing was that this was an economy that was supposed to have no wage labor. The key to the original idea of socialism was that it was an economic system where you didn't have employment relations between people who had capital and people who did not. Instead, what you had was cooperative production carried on by producer cooperatives, labor cooperatives. And instead of people being paid wages, they would get a guaranteed share of any profit brought about by that productive activity. So profit sharing rather than wage labor. And John Stuart Mill captured this idea when he said that he looked forward to a world in which labor would hire capital rather than capital hiring labor. And two key concepts are the concepts of monopoly and free exchange, because these early socialists believed that the capitalist system they were confronting was one dominated by monopoly. They did not think it was truly competitive. And instead, they proposed, they said, an economy of free exchange, one of completely free exchange without the, as they saw it, distorting effects of things like private ownership of land and the wage system. But then there was a very sudden change. In the 1870s, the commonly understood meaning of the term socialism underwent a dramatic shift, and it came to mean what it means now, an economy that has a significant role for government and for the political process more generally. So after the 1870s, socialism very suddenly comes to mean what we understand the term to mean now, and this is the meaning it's had ever since. A key concept becomes the idea of economic democracy, which is the idea essentially that the economic process should, to a greater or lesser degree, be controlled and directed by the political process, that political decisions, democratic in some cases, will override the spontaneous process of market exchange. This is supposed to be subordinating the economic process to the political one, to the demands of democratic politics. You also get, in the 1870s, the first time ever that the word or term state socialism is used. And this is a sign of the idea that socialism is increasingly being associated with an active role for the state in the economy. The actual word that's used initially is Staatssozialismus, the German term. The reason why this is used is because the term state socialism, Staatssozialismus, is first used to describe the economic policy of this man. I hope you would know who this is, but if you don't, it is, of course, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Prussia and subsequently Imperial Germany. And state socialism was a term coined by his critics, actually, to describe his economic policies that he followed from the middle of the 1870s onwards, and particularly after 1878. Now, soon after this, about 20 years later, so in the 1890s and early 1900s, the socialist tradition, in its newly understood meaning, undergoes a bifurcation, and it develops into two quite different forms. The first of these is social democracy. Now, the man who originally formulates this is Bernstein, the leading German social democrat who comes up with the ideas as a kind of critique of orthodox Marxism. There's also, however, the Fabian socialists, the Webbs, George Bernard Shaw and others in the UK. There's Jean Jaurès in France, Van Damme, the Belgian socialist leader. Also, a very important figure, Hjalmar Branting, the man who effectively creates the Swedish Social Democratic Party. Not very well known outside Sweden, but actually a very important figure in this. So that's the first tradition, social democracy. The other is revolutionary socialism, and in particular, Leninism. Now, Leninism is a kind of amendment of orthodox Marxism. What happens is that up until 1917, it's only one of several forms of revolutionary socialism. But after 1917, for obvious reasons, Leninism is the overwhelmingly dominant form that revolutionary socialism takes. So from about the 1900s, you have two different understandings of what the term socialism means, which have to do with the kind of politics that is meant to override market processes. For social democrats, it's democratic politics. For revolutionary socialists, it's revolutionary socialism, typically led by an organized party, which is another one of Lenin's ideas. Now, we'll look first of all at the attempts to put the revolutionary socialist idea into practice. And of course, in 1917, a revolutionary socialist party, the Bolsheviks, actually capture control of a large and important state, Russia. So this is a huge opportunity for the Bolsheviks to put their ideas into practice. But they actually have a problem because at the time, being Marxists, it was not clear to them exactly what socialism meant. They understood that it meant the state, the agent of the proletariat in their way of thinking, taking over control of the economy. But they had no real idea about how to work this out in detail. So they were actually in the strange position of wanting to impose socialism without having any kind of really worked out idea of what a socialist state-controlled economy would be like. And so what they go for is something called war communism. This is a state-owned and controlled economy which has no money, no markets, no prices, and also no wages. It's based on the ideas partly of an Austrian economist called Otto Neurath, who argued that in a planned state-controlled economy, you didn't need prices or money. You could just use quantitative measures, so many tons of iron, for example, to work out what you needed to produce and how you went about it. So that was the original thing the Bolsheviks tried between 1917 and 1923. It was a total disaster. The Russian economy quite simply collapsed. It was not that it worked badly, it simply stopped working completely. And over the 5 years or so in which war communism was in place, pretty much the entire economic system stopped functioning to any meaningful degree. Now, this is often blamed on the Civil War, but in fact, the Civil War ends in 1921, and if anything, the situation in the Russian economy gets worse after that rather than better. Plus, the collapse of the economy was marked equally in areas that were badly affected by the Civil War and in areas that were relatively unscathed by it. So it's clearly the economic policy that brings about this collapse. The war didn't help, but it was only an exacerbating factor, not the primary factor. So in 1923, the Bolsheviks pulled back and they introduced the new economic policy. This is often associated with a slogan that Lenin had actually come up with in 1904, 1 step backward, 2 steps forward. The idea is that you have to take a step backwards in order to then advance further, take 2 steps forward. Now that's important because what it means is that the new economic policy was presented and understood by the Bolshevik leadership as being a kind of tactical withdrawal before they resumed the onward march to their idea of a socialist economy. What it meant was that there was a return to money, there was a return to prices, and there was also some private enterprise allowed, the so-called NEP men. And in particular, they encouraged the peasants to produce and sell their crops at a profit to the urban population to deal with what had been the most acute and severe consequence of war communism, which was widespread famine. This led to the emergence of a subclass of fairly successful property-owning peasants, the kulaks, as they came to be called later on. Now, what happened then was that there was an enormous debate in the Bolshevik Party, particularly after Lenin's death, between roughly 1924 and 1929. And this was a very intense argument about what to do. They could tell that war communism had failed, but they were still all committed to the idea of a state-controlled economy. So what to do now? And there were 3 factions. The first was the left, led by Trotsky. They argued that what had to be done was to spread the revolution outside Russia. And they wanted to go back quite a long way towards war communism to basically reverse the reforms of the new economic policy era. On the right, the other wing of the Bolshevik Party was Nikolai Bukharin. His idea was that they should build socialism at a snail's pace, as he put it. His argument was that you would have to take a very long time, about 60, 70 years minimum, maybe even 100 years, to actually move to a completely socialist economy. In the meantime, you had to encourage the kulaks, the peasant class in particular, and build on the reforms of the NEP. Now, this would have led to a very state-controlled economy, but one with a largely privatized agricultural sector and also probably a small private trading sector. So this was a more moderate version of the idea. In the middle was the center, and this was Stalin and 2 other leading Bolsheviks, Zinoviev and Kamenev. The idea they came up with was that of state corporatism. Basically, they thought that the most advanced form of economic organization in the world was the large corporation. And the idea was to turn the whole economy of the Soviet Union into basically one giant corporation. And if you look at the structure that they eventually came up with, the structure of production ministries with one ministry in charge of each sector of the economy, all coordinated by a central planning board, Gosplan as it was called, it does actually look, in terms of its organizational chart, very similar to the kind of organizational chart of a very large private business. But the point, of course, is that it's just one business for the entire economy. So it's a monopoly state. It's a kind of way of organizing the economy in which the whole economy is organized as one single large corporation that has a complete monopoly of all the economic activity. Now, what happens as a result of this? Well, of course, as we know, Stalin wins the argument. He allies with the right to exile Trotsky, and then he turns on the right, Bukharin and his allies, and crushes them. And the result, first of all, is forced collectivization of agriculture. This leads in the Ukraine to what is known in Ukrainian as the Holodomor, a kind of word that means something like Holocaust. 10 million people starved to death. Much of the famine is actually quite deliberately caused by the Communist Party in order to break the resistance of the kulaks. There's also the introduction of the 5-year plan. Planned forced industrialization, very rapid industrialization, paid for by exporting raw materials. So the way that the industrialization of the 5-year plan was done was by importing German and American equipment and machine tools and paying for it by exporting raw materials, grain in particular, but also diamonds, minerals of various kinds. The party increasingly is opposed to this, but Stalin's response is to launch the Great Terror. And between 1932 and 1939, he kills 98% of the party's membership and kills virtually all of the old Bolsheviks. Only a handful who are his cronies survive. At the same time, in order to break resistance to the program of forced industrialization, millions of ordinary people are killed during one of the most terrible experiences in human history. So the Soviet Union does industrialize, but the cost is terrible. Now, what happens afterwards? Well, in the 1950s and early 1960s, the USSR's GDP is actually growing very rapidly. In fact, in some years in the 1950s, it actually grows more rapidly than the United States. But what this actually shows you is how misleading GDP figures can be. There's continuing problems in agriculture. The Soviet agricultural sector never recovered from the catastrophe of forced collectivization. And there are chronic problems of food shortages, difficulties in supplying the needs of the urban population. There are major riots, for example, in Novocherkassk in 1961, suppressed, of course, by the party. There's also a chronic failure to produce consumer goods. The Soviet economy turns out to be reasonably good for quite a while at producing things like mass steel or tanks, but it's not very good at producing goods that ordinary people want. There's also a structural problem with investment. The great problem with this system was that it was not clear to the planners exactly what they should invest in and where they should make the investments. And over time, this problem of misdirected investment gets steadily worse and worse. After 1963, the economy stops growing and it becomes stagnant. But at the same time, it still has to maintain an enormously expensive military to compete with the United States. And eventually, of course, it collapses. Now, it's worth saying this kind of story is not only found in the USSR. This is the standard story of revolutionary socialism. In China, as it says here, you have the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1962, which leads to 45 million deaths in the greatest famine in the whole of human history. Ethiopia, under Mengistu, again experiences a catastrophic collapse in agricultural output and a terrible famine. Tanzania is an interesting case because there you don't have a despot. You have a leader who is actually a decent human being, Julius Nyerere, so you don't get the kind of mass slaughter that you get under, say, Stalin or Mao, but the policy of Ujamaa, as it was called, which he introduced, another form of state socialism, was again a complete economic disaster. Generally speaking, communist states in East Asia, such as North Korea, or in Eastern Europe after World War II, have extremely bad economic performances compared to their Western counterparts. North and South Korea and East and West Germany are the kind of classic natural experiments, if you will. In the current world, we have the example of Venezuela, which has also gone down the same route with the same disastrous results. In fact, Venezuela has seen the biggest collapse in an economy since we had war communism. Now, what about social democracy? This is actually the much more successful variant of socialism. Now, classical social democracy, up until the 1950s, is a clear alternative to market capitalism. It's not a kind of watered down version of capitalism. It's something quite different. It means that the state will not own the bulk of the economy, but it will own the commanding heights, the key sectors. And because the state owns those key sectors, it will give control of the rest of the economy. It doesn't need to actually own the rest of the economy. The rest of the economy, it was thought, would have to work within the framework set by the state-controlled sector, the commanding heights. There is a state-directed economy. Politics is going to decide all the key economic realities. But in theory, this is combined with democracy, a competitive party system, for example, free elections, and also with liberal rights, protections of things like free speech. There's a strong emphasis on social collectivism and nationalism in practice. This is captured in the Swedish slogan of the national home, where the idea is that society is organized like a large household. So whereas the Bolsheviks saw the economy as being like a single giant corporation, the Social Democrats, particularly in Sweden, but also elsewhere, tend to think of the whole economy as being like one big household. Consumption is actually downplayed. When they're told, the early social democrats, that they're going to be less private consumption, they are not downcast by that. They actually see that as one of the good things about the system that they want. You want to have collective consumption, they thought, rather than individual consumption. And they also were quite keen on the idea of rationing, because that meant, they thought, more socially organized consumption, but also more equality. They were hostile to the welfare state in its two predominant modern forms, that of an insurance-based system or a redistributive one. Instead, they wanted something called a national minimum or service state, which is a political system and an economic system where the state provides a number of key goods free of charge. The National Health Service is an example of this principle, but the idea was to apply it more widely. So what happened? Well, there were big moves in this direction during and after World War II, up until about the middle of the 1940s, in a number of countries. But interestingly, everywhere between 1947 and 1952, this tendency is defeated. And in several cases, social democratic governments actually pull back from it and don't follow through on their own program. In other places, they suffer political defeat. There were worries about the compatibility with liberty and democracy. So in Britain, for example, the Attlee government in 1947 introduces state direction of labour, or rather continues the state direction of labour that had been introduced during World War II, so that the Minister of Labour could tell people what job they were going to do. But they were very unhappy about this. They could tell, and they knew, that this was actually highly problematic for civil liberties. And so they were quite happy when the Americans forced them to abandon it as a condition for taking a dollar loan. There were also problems with consumerism. The big problem with that classic form of social democracy was that it was not compatible with the idea of personal choice or with a consumer economy. And finally, it also, in practice, tended to have poor investment performance. The classic example of this in the British case was the groundnut scheme, where there was an idea to grow huge amounts of peanuts, groundnuts, in East Africa, British colony at that time, and this was a catastrophic failure. And that was always the kind of classic textbook example of the problems with state investment, but there were a number of others. So there was another shift, and social democracy took on another meaning, and that's the meaning that to a great extent it still has. It was reinvented in this way in the 1950s. In some ways, as it says here, it was a case of going back to a kind of policy that had actually been tried out earlier in two particular countries, one being New Zealand, the other being Uruguay, under José Batalla y Ordóñez, the man who was president of Uruguay in the 1900s. The key figures are the British intellectual Anthony Crosland and the Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander. But also another key event is the Social Democratic Party's Congress at Bad Godesberg, the German Social Democrats, that is, when they abandon Marxism and traditional social democracy and adopt this new kind of model. So what was it? Well, first of all, it's that you give up on the idea of having a completely or predominantly state-directed economy. Instead, you have an economy that is actually predominantly a market economy. Secondly, you combine that, however, with extensive redistribution via a very large welfare state and high taxes on high incomes. So you have a market economy, but you then redistribute the wealth that that market economy produces through public spending, high taxes, and a large welfare state. You have regulation of the economy up to a point. The Swedish economy, for example, is actually less regulated than the American one. So although there is regulation, the degree of that regulation can vary from one particular country to another. And you also initially had the idea of tripartite negotiation. This was the idea that you should set national economic policy by a tripartite negotiation between the government, organized labor, and organized business. And this was the model that you find in many, many parts of the world in the 1950s and 1960s. And this is combined with Keynesian demand management. So Keynesianism, which had originally not been associated with social democracy, comes to be a central part of the social democratic package. Now, the record of this is actually much more successful than that of revolutionary socialism, to put it mildly. And between 1950 and 1970, roughly, you have something like a golden age for that kind of policy, and it appears to work really, really well. But two key aspects broke down in the 1970s. The tripartite policy broke down, but more crucially, the Keynesian demand management policy stopped working. And instead of working to keep the economy balanced, it came to produce severe misallocation of resources. And above all, it led to the combination of a stagnant economy and inflation. Plus, there were longer term problems with this revised form of social democracy. One of them was cultural innovation, which actually in various ways undermined it. And in particular, in the 1960s, there's a move towards cultural individualism, which is not really compatible with that kind of social democracy, much less the classic version. And there's also a problem of economic innovation. Social democratic economies have the same kind of problem as revolutionary socialist ones, which is that they're not very innovative. They're more innovative by quite a way than the state economy of the Soviet Union, but they're still not fully successful. And so what we have here are two quite different kinds of socialism. One of them has been pretty much a disaster wherever it has been tried. The other, much more successful, but it still has very serious problems economically. This, of course, is quite apart from any philosophical or other principled objections that you might have to social democracy as a way of organizing society. But it's still there as the major competitor for the pure free market approach.